Marcus Chen stood at the edge of what looked like a disaster. The old Blackwater mine stretched before him like a wound in the earth, its entrance half submerged in murky brown water that reflected nothing but disappointment. Rusted equipment lay scattered around the perimeter like the bones of some ancient beast, and the wooden support beams that still stood upright leaned at angles that suggested surrender rather than strength. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. He kicked a stone into the water and watched the ripples spread outward, carrying with them the last of his hope. 3 months ago, his grandfather had passed away, leaving behind nothing but debt, a ramshackle cabin, and this flooded pit that the lawyers had generously called mineral rights. The inheritance papers made it sound almost valuable. The reality was a joke that nobody was laughing at. Marcus pulled the crumpled letter from his jacket pocket for the 100th time, squinting at his grandfather's shaky handwriting in the fading afternoon light. "The earth keeps her secrets well, but she rewards those who listen," the old man had written. "What looks like ruin today might be tomorrow's miracle. Don't give up on the deep places." Easy for him to say. Grandfather Chen had spent 40 years chasing fool's gold and silver dreams that never materialized. Now Marcus was supposed to believe that this waterlogged mess held some kind of treasure? The bank notices in his truck told a different story. He had 60 days to either make the property pay or lose it to foreclosure, along with his grandfather's cabin and the 20 acres of pine forest that surrounded it. Marcus had driven up from Phoenix with nothing but a duffel bag and a head full of doubts. His marriage had crumbled 6 months earlier when Sarah finally got tired of waiting for him to find steady work. The construction company he'd built from scratch had folded during the recession, taking with it everything he'd worked for. His 8-year-old daughter Emma lived with her mother now, and the child support payments were just another weight pressing down on his shoulders. The small town of Copper Ridge hadn't changed much since his childhood visits. Main Street still consisted of the same weathered storefronts, the same faded awnings, and the same cluster of pickup trucks parked outside Murphy's Diner. Population 847, according to the welcome sign, though Marcus suspected that number was optimistic. This was the kind of place young people left and never came back to, the kind of place where dreams came to die quietly among the sagebrush and abandoned mines. He'd checked into the Pineview Motel that morning, a collection of log cabins that had seen better decades. The elderly woman at the front desk, who introduced herself as Dorothy, had looked at him with the kind of sympathy reserved for lost causes and stray dogs. "You're old Chen's grandson," she'd said. Not a question, but a statement delivered with the certainty of someone who'd lived in a small town long enough to know everyone's business. "Heard you inherited the Blackwater. That's a shame." "Why's that?" Marcus had asked, though he suspected he already knew. Dorothy had shaken her head, her silver curls catching the light from the window. "Been flooded for 15 years, ever since the spring runoff got worse than usual. Your grandfather, bless his soul, he kept saying he was going to pump it out, get back to work. But that takes money, and mining equipment, and—" She trailed off, leaving the obvious unsaid. Now, standing at the mine's edge, as the sun began to sink behind the mountains, Marcus understood exactly what Dorothy had meant. The water was dark and still, like a mirror reflecting nothing but problems. He could see debris floating on the surface, old planks, a rusted bucket, what looked like the remains of a wooden ladder. Whatever his grandfather had been digging for, it was buried under thousands of gallons of stagnant water and 15 years of accumulated junk. Marcus walked around the perimeter, his boots crunching on gravel and broken glass. The mine office was a small wooden building that leaned heavily to one side, its windows clouded with dust and spiderwebs. The door hung open on broken hinges, revealing an interior that looked like a tornado had hit it. Papers were scattered everywhere, many of them stained with water damage and mouse droppings. An old desk sat against one wall, its drawers pulled out and empty. He picked up a few of the papers, trying to make sense of his grandfather's records. Most of it was illegible, faded receipts and geological surveys from decades past. But one document caught his attention. A letter from something called the Colorado Mining Assessment Bureau, dated just 2 years ago. The letterhead was official, the language formal and bureaucratic. Subject: Geological Survey Update, Blackwater Mine Property, Marcus read aloud, his voice echoing slightly in the small space. Recent seismic data suggests significant geological formations at depth levels previously unexplored. Recommend further investigation of lower shafts, particularly in sectors J7 through J12. Mineral composition analysis indicates potential for semi-precious stone deposits. Marcus folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his pocket. Semi-precious stones weren't exactly a fortune, but they were better than nothing. The question was how to get to these lower shafts when the entire mine was underwater. He spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the property, taking inventory of what was salvageable. There was more equipment than he'd initially thought, most of it rusted but potentially functional. An old generator sat under a tarp behind the office, and what looked like a water pump was half buried in weeds near the mine entrance. If he could get the pump working, maybe he could at least see what was down there. As the sun disappeared behind the pine trees, Marcus drove back into town, his mind churning with possibilities and problems in equal measure. Murphy's Diner was the only place with lights on, so he parked outside and pushed through the front door into warmth and the smell of coffee and fried food. The interior was exactly what he'd expected. Red vinyl booths, a long counter with spinning stools, and walls covered with photographs of the town's better days. A handful of locals sat scattered around the room, their conversations dying down as they noticed the stranger. Marcus chose a booth near the window and picked up the laminated menu. "You must be Chen's boy," a voice said. Marcus looked up to see a man in his 60s sliding into the booth across from him. He was built like a tree trunk, with massive hands and a face weathered by decades of outdoor work. "Name's Jack Morrison. I worked with your grandfather off and on for about 10 years. Marcus shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip and the calluses that spoke of hard labor. "Marcus Chen. Nice to meet you." Jack gestured toward the window, in the direction of the mine. "Heard you inherited the old Blackwater. That's a hell of a thing to leave someone. You sound like you know it well. Should. I was down there with your grandfather the day it flooded." Jack's expression grew distant, as if he was looking back through years of accumulated memory. "Spring of 2009. We'd been having a wet winter, more snow than anybody could remember. When it all started melting at once, the water table rose faster than we could handle. A waitress appeared, a young woman with tired eyes and a coffee pot. Marcus ordered a burger and coffee, then turned his attention back to Jack. "My grandfather never mentioned you," Marcus said, which wasn't exactly true. The old man had mentioned a lot of people over the years, but Marcus hadn't been paying close attention during those childhood visits. Jack chuckled, but there wasn't much humor in it. "Your grandfather was a proud man, probably didn't want to admit he needed help. But we were partners, in a way. I had the equipment, he had the claim. We were supposed to split whatever we found." "Find anything?" Jack was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the table. When he spoke, his voice was careful, measured. "We were close to something. Real close. Your grandfather had been following a vein of quartz that kept getting richer the deeper we went. The last day before the flood, we hit a pocket that made his eyes light up like Christmas morning." Marcus leaned forward. "What kind of pocket?" "Hard to say. We didn't have time to properly examine it before the water came, but I remember the way the rocks looked in the lamplight, the way they caught and threw back the beam like they had their own fire inside." Jack paused as the waitress returned with Marcus's coffee. "Your grandfather always said the best treasures hide in the deepest places." The burger arrived, and Marcus ate while Jack continued talking. The older man had a storyteller's rhythm, painting pictures of the mine in its working days, when the sound of picks and shovels echoed through the tunnels and dust-covered men emerged into daylight with hope in their eyes and dirt under their fingernails. "The thing about mining," Jack said, "is that it's equal parts science and faith. You can study all the geological surveys you want, analyze rock samples until your eyes cross, but in the end, you're still making a bet against the Earth. And the Earth doesn't give up her secrets easily." Marcus thought about the letter in his pocket, the mention of lower shafts and mineral deposits. "If you were going to try again, what would you do first?" Jack's eyes sharpened. "You thinking about pumping it out?" "I'm thinking about a lot of things. None of them particularly realistic." "Realistic's overrated." Jack leaned back in his seat, studying Marcus with the kind of attention usually reserved for livestock auctions or poker games. "You got any money to work with?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Marcus almost laughed. "Not exactly rolling in cash at the moment." "Equipment?" "Whatever's up there, rusting in the weather." Jack nodded slowly, as if he'd expected as much. "Well then, looks like you're in the same position your grandfather was in for most of his life. Rich in possibilities, poor in everything else." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the sounds of the diner washing over them like white noise. Outside, the first stars were appearing in the clear mountain sky, and the temperature was dropping toward what promised to be a cold night. "I'll make you a deal," Jack said finally. "I've got some equipment sitting in storage, collecting dust and costing me money. Pumps, generators, some other stuff that might be useful. You can borrow it, no charge, on one condition." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Which is?" "If you find anything down there, anything worth selling, we split it 60-40. You get the 60 since it's your claim." It was a generous offer, probably more generous than Marcus deserved, but generosity in small towns often came with hidden costs, and he'd learned to be suspicious of deals that seemed too good to be true. "Why would you do that?" Marcus asked. "You don't even know me." Jack smiled, and this time there was genuine warmth in it. "Because I made a promise to your grandfather. The day before he died, he called me up, said he was worried about what would happen to the mine, asked me to keep an eye on it, make sure whoever inherited it got a fair chance." He paused, his expression growing serious. "And because I've been wondering for 15 years what was in that pocket we found. Curiosity's a powerful thing, especially when you get to be my age." Marcus considered the offer while he finished his burger. It wasn't like he had a lot of other options. The bank notices weren't going to disappear, and Sarah's lawyer wasn't going to stop calling about child support. If there was even a small chance that the mine held something valuable, he had to try. "All right," he said, extending his hand across the table. "Partners." Jack's handshake was firm and final, the kind that sealed deals and started adventures. "Partners. We'll start Monday morning, assuming the weather holds. I'll bring the equipment up Sunday night." They talked for another hour, Jack sharing stories about the mine's history and the various characters who'd tried their luck there over the decades. The Blackwater had been worked intermittently since the 1920s, when a prospector named William Blackwater had found traces of silver in the surrounding rocks. The silver had played out quickly, but subsequent owners had continued digging, convinced that something valuable lay deeper in the earth. "The problem with most of them," Jack explained, "is that they expected quick results. Mining's not a get-rich-quick scheme. It's a long, slow process of following clues and making educated guesses. Your grandfather understood that. He was patient, methodical. If anyone was going to find something in that hole, it would have been him." When Marcus finally left the diner, his head was spinning with plans and possibilities. The drive back to the motel took him past the mine entrance, and he pulled over for a moment to stare at the dark water reflecting the stars. Somewhere beneath that still surface lay the answers to questions his grandfather had spent decades asking. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost covering the pine needles and a thin layer of ice on the water in the mine. Marcus spent the early hours going through his grandfather's cabin, looking for anything that might provide clues about the mine's potential. The cabin was small and cluttered, filled with the accumulated debris of a long life lived simply. In a closet, he found boxes of geological surveys, ore samples, and hand-drawn maps of the mine's tunnels. His grandfather had been meticulous in his record-keeping, documenting every shaft, every promising vein, every dead end. The maps were works of art in their own way, showing not just the physical layout of the mine, but the story of decades spent searching for something that might not exist. One map caught Marcus's attention. It showed the lower levels of the mine, the areas that had been flooded for 15 years. Red X marks indicated where his grandfather had found promising rock samples, and there were handwritten notes in the margins. Rich quartz vein continues down, read one. Unusual crystal formations need further investigation, read another. But it was a note at the bottom of the map that made Marcus's pulse quicken. In his grandfather's careful handwriting were the words, J11 Sector, Large cavity discovered March 15, 2009. Contents unknown due to flooding. Potential for significant find. March 15, 2009. Just days before the flood that had ended his grandfather's mining career. Whatever the old man had discovered in that cavity had been lost beneath the rising water, preserved like a time capsule waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to retrieve it. Marcus spread the maps out on the kitchen table and began making his own notes, cross-referencing his grandfather's observations with the official geological survey he'd found in the mine office. The picture that emerged was tantalizing. Multiple sources seemed to agree that the lower levels of the mine held geological formations unlike anything in the upper shafts. The phone rang, startling him out of his concentration. The caller ID showed a Phoenix number he recognized, Sarah's lawyer. Mr. Chen. The voice was crisp and professional. I'm calling regarding the outstanding child support payments. We need to discuss a payment plan, or we'll have no choice but to pursue other options. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility and failure settling on his shoulders. I understand. Can you give me another month? I'm working on something that might change my situation. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Mr. Chen, we've been patient, but Emma's needs can't wait for your business ventures to pay off. If we don't see a significant payment by the end of next week, we'll have to proceed with garnishment proceedings. The line went dead, leaving Marcus staring at the phone in his hand. End of next week. 7 days to either come up with money he didn't have or find a way to make the mine pay off. It was an impossible timeline, but impossible seemed to be his specialty lately. He spent the rest of the day cleaning and organizing his grandfather's equipment, trying to determine what was salvageable and what was beyond hope. The work gave him something to focus on besides his mounting problems, and by evening, he had a better sense of what they would be working with. Sunday arrived gray and overcast, with the smell of snow in the air. Jack Morrison arrived at the mine just after noon, driving a flatbed truck loaded with equipment. Behind him came a second truck, driven by a younger man who looked like a smaller version of Jack. Same broad shoulders, same weathered hands, same direct gaze. This is my son Danny, Jack said, making introductions. He's handy with machinery and will need all the help we can get. Danny Morrison looked to be in his 30s, with the kind of quiet competence that comes from years of working with his hands. He nodded at Marcus without much enthusiasm, clearly reserving judgment on this stranger who'd inherited what everyone in town considered a worthless hole in the ground. They spent the afternoon unloading and setting up equipment. Jack had brought 2 industrial pumps, a generator powerful enough to run them, and an assortment of hoses, cables, and tools. It was more sophisticated gear than Marcus had expected, clearly worth thousands of dollars. You've been planning this for a while, Marcus observed as they positioned the first pump near the mine entrance. Jack paused in his work, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool air. Like I said, curiosity's a powerful thing. I've been thinking about that last day for 15 years, wondering what we might have found if we'd had more time. They worked until dark, setting up a system that would pump water from the mine into a drainage channel that led away from the property. The process would be slow. Jack estimated it would take at least a week to lower the water level enough to safely enter the upper tunnels, and longer still to reach the deeper levels where his grandfather had made his final discoveries. The key, Jack explained as they secured the equipment for the night, is patience. We try to rush this, we'll end up with cave-ins, equipment failures, maybe worse. The mine's been waiting 15 years. It can wait another week or 2. Marcus nodded, though patience felt like a luxury he couldn't afford. 7 days until the lawyer made good on his threats. 60 days until the bank foreclosed on the property. Time was running out faster than water from a broken dam. That night, he lay in his narrow motel bed, listening to the wind in the pine trees and thinking about Emma. She'd called earlier, full of 8-year-old enthusiasm about a school project on rocks and minerals. The irony wasn't lost on him. While he was literally digging for rocks that might save his financial future, his daughter was learning about geology in a warm classroom hundreds of miles away. "Daddy, did you know that diamonds are made from carbon?" she'd asked, her voice bright with discovery. "My teacher says they form deep underground, where it's really hot and there's lots of pressure. And sometimes they stay hidden for millions of years before somebody finds them." "That's amazing, sweetheart," he'd replied, trying to keep the sadness out of his voice. "Maybe someday you can be a geologist and discover your own diamonds." "Maybe we can do it together," she'd said, and the simple faith in her voice had almost broken his heart. Now, staring at the ceiling of the motel room, Marcus wondered if he was chasing the same impossible dreams that had consumed his grandfather. But what choice did he have? The conventional path, finding a job, working for someone else, slowly paying off his debts, would take years he didn't have, and might not even be enough to keep up with his obligations. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost covering everything like a blanket of tiny diamonds. Marcus arrived at the mine to find the pumps already running, their steady rhythm echoing off the surrounding hills. Jack was there ahead of him, checking gauges and adjusting settings with the focused attention of a man who understood machinery. "How long have you been here?" Marcus asked. "Couple hours. Wanted to make sure everything was running smooth." Jack gestured toward the mine entrance, where the water level had already dropped several inches. "At this rate, we should be able to start exploring the upper tunnels by Thursday or Friday." They spent the morning setting up a more permanent camp near the mine. Jack had brought a canvas shelter, folding chairs, and a camp stove, transforming the area from an industrial wasteland into something that resembled a base of operations. Danny arrived with coffee and sandwiches, and for the first time since inheriting the mine, Marcus began to feel like the project might actually have a chance of success. "What exactly are we looking for?" Danny asked as they ate lunch, watching the steady stream of muddy water flowing from the pumps. It was a good question, one that Marcus had been wondering about himself. His grandfather's notes mentioned quartz veins and unusual crystal formations, but that could mean almost anything. "Semi-precious stones, according to the Geological Survey," Marcus replied. "Garnets, maybe some amethyst or tourmaline. Nothing that's going to make us rich, but enough to pay some bills if we're lucky." Jack looked at him over his coffee cup, an unreadable expression on his weathered face. "Your grandfather never told you about the stones he found?" "What stones?" "The ones he showed me the week before he died. Beautiful things, like nothing I'd ever seen before. Clear as water, but with fire inside, catching light and throwing it back in colors that didn't seem natural." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. He never mentioned anything like that to me. He was secretive about his finds, especially toward the end. Said too many people had been disappointed by the mine over the years, didn't want to get anybody's hopes up until he was sure what he had. Danny leaned forward, interested despite himself. "What did they look like?" Jack closed his eyes, as if trying to recall a dream. "Hard to describe. They were clear, mostly, but when you held them up to the light, they threw off colors like a prism. Reds, blues, greens, all swirling together. Your grandfather called them firestones." Marcus's mouth went dry. Clear stones with exceptional brilliance and fire. It sounded like Jack was describing diamonds. But that was impossible. Diamonds weren't found in this part of Colorado, weren't found in the kind of geological formations that made up the Blackwater mine. "How big were they?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "The ones he showed me were small, maybe the size of peas, but he said there were larger ones still down in the mine, too big to bring up before the flooding started." The three men sat in silence for a while, the only sound, the steady rhythm of the pumps and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. Marcus tried to process what Jack had told him, tried to balance hope against the crushing weight of experience. He'd been disappointed too many times to get carried away by stories of hidden treasure. But something in Jack's voice, something in the careful way he described the stones, made Marcus think the older man was telling the truth. And if he was, if there really were diamonds hidden in the depths of the Blackwater mine, then everything changed. The afternoon brought unexpected visitors. A black SUV pulled up to the mine site, and two men in expensive suits climbed out. They looked out of place in the mountain setting, their polished shoes and clean hands marking them as outsiders, as clearly as if they'd worn signs. The older of the two men approached the camp, his smile practiced and professional. "Gentlemen, I'm Robert Hayes from Mountain West Development. This is my associate, Mr. Patterson. We understand you're the new owner of this property, Mr. Chen." Marcus stood slowly, recognizing the type, if not the specific individuals. He'd dealt with enough developers and investors during his construction days to know when someone was sizing up a potential acquisition. "That's right. What can I do for you?" Hayes gestured toward the mine, his smile never wavering. "We represent a consortium of investors interested in purchasing mineral rights in this area." We've been keeping an eye on the Blackwater property for some time, waiting for the right opportunity to make an offer. I'm not interested in selling. Of course. But perhaps you'd be willing to listen to our proposal before making any final decisions. Hayes reached into his jacket and pulled out a leather portfolio. We're prepared to offer you $200,000 for the mineral rights, with you retaining ownership of the surface property. Cash deal, closing within 30 days. Marcus felt his knees go weak. $200,000 would solve every problem he had, would let him start over somewhere else with a clean slate. But something about the timing bothered him. Hayes and his associate had shown up just as the mine was being pumped out, just as he was beginning to explore what lay beneath the water. "How did you know I was here?" Marcus asked. Hayes' smile flickered slightly. "Small town, word travels fast. We heard someone was working the old Blackwater again, figured it might be worth a conversation." Jack Morrison had been silent during the exchange, but now he stepped forward, his expression hard. "Funny timing you showing up just now, almost like you knew something was happening here." Patterson, who hadn't spoken before, gave Jack a look that was pure ice. "Mr. Morrison, isn't it? We're simply trying to conduct business here. Perhaps you should let Mr. Chen speak for himself." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Marcus found himself caught between the practical voice in his head. Take the money, solve your problems, get out while you can, and something deeper. A stubborn refusal to give up on his grandfather's dreams. "I appreciate the offer," Marcus said finally, "but I'm not ready to make that kind of decision yet. Give me some time to think about it." Hayes nodded, though his smile had lost some of its warmth. "Of course, but don't take too long, Mr. Chen. Opportunities like this don't come along every day." He handed Marcus a business card. "Call me when you're ready to be reasonable." The two men climbed back into their SUV and drove away, leaving behind the smell of expensive cologne and the feeling that something important had just happened, though Marcus wasn't sure what. "Well," Jack said, watching the dust settle, "that was interesting. You know them?" "I know the type, vultures, circling around looking for easy pickings." Jack spit into the dirt. "Question is, how did they know to come here right now? You tell anybody else about what we're doing?" Marcus shook his head. The only people who knew about the mining operation were the three of them, plus Dorothy at the motel, and maybe a few other locals who'd seen the equipment being delivered. Danny, who'd been quiet during the encounter, spoke up. "Dad, remember what happened over at the Silver Creek claim last year? Those same type of guys showed up right before Jimmy Kelson found that vein of copper ore." Jack's expression darkened. And somehow they knew exactly what he'd found before he'd even had a chance to assay it properly. A chill ran down Marcus's spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. If Hayes and his consortium had inside information about the mine, if they knew something he didn't, then the stakes were higher than he'd realized. That evening, Marcus sat in his motel room with his grandfather's map spread out on the small table, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The offer from Mountain West Development changed everything. $200,000 was more money than he'd seen in years, enough to pay off his debts and start fresh somewhere else. But it was also a sign that the mine might be worth more than anyone had realized. Companies like Mountain West didn't throw around that kind of money unless they expected to make a profit. If they were willing to pay $200,000 for mineral rights, what did they think those rights were actually worth? He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in months. "Sarah? It's Marcus." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When his ex-wife spoke, her voice was carefully neutral. "What do you want, Marcus?" "I wanted to talk to Emma, if that's okay. And I wanted to let you know that things might be changing soon. With my financial situation, I mean." Another pause. "Marcus, we've been down this road before. You always think something's going to change, some big break is just around the corner. But Emma needs stability, not promises." "I know, and I'm going to give her that. I just need a little more time." Sarah's sigh carried clearly over the phone line. "How much time?" "Because the lawyers already filed the paperwork for garnishment. If you don't make a substantial payment by Friday, they're going to start taking money directly from any wages you earn." Friday. 3 days away. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of time running out. Can you put Emma on the phone? She's already asleep. It's a school night. Right. Of course. Marcus rubbed his forehead, trying to think clearly. Sarah, what if I told you I might have found something? Something that could change everything? I'd say I've heard that before, too. Her voice softened slightly. Marcus, I don't want to hurt you, but I can't keep believing in your dreams when Emma's reality is what matters. She needs child support. She needs to know her father is going to be there for her, not chasing some fantasy in a hole in the ground. The line went quiet except for the soft sound of Sarah's breathing. Marcus wanted to tell her about the mine, about Jack's stories of firestones and mysterious geological formations. But he could hear the exhaustion in her voice, the accumulated weight of disappointment from years of broken promises and failed ventures. I understand, he said finally. Give Emma my love. I will. And Marcus? I hope you find what you're looking for. I really do. But please don't let it cost you what you already have. After she hung up, Marcus sat staring at the phone for a long time. What did he already have? A failed marriage, mounting debts, and a daughter who barely knew him because he was always chasing the next opportunity. The next chance to strike it rich and solve all his problems at once. Maybe Sarah was right. Maybe he should take Hayes' offer, pay off his debts, and find a normal job that would let him be a normal father. The practical voice in his head made a compelling argument. Bird in the hand, financial security, a chance to rebuild his relationship with Emma on solid ground. But then he thought about his grandfather, spending 40 years following his instincts and his dreams, never giving up even when everyone else said he was chasing shadows. The old man had died, believing there was something valuable hidden in the depths of the Blackwater mine. Did Marcus have the right to give up on that dream, without at least seeing what lay beneath the water? He spread the maps out again, studying his grandfather's careful notations and hand-drawn diagrams. Somewhere in those tunnels was the answer to questions that had haunted the Chen family for decades. The water level was dropping steadily, and by the end of the week, they might finally know what secrets the Earth had been keeping. The decision, when it came, felt less like a choice than an inevitability. Marcus folded the maps carefully and placed them back in their box. He would see this through, whatever the cost. He owed that much to his grandfather, to Emma, and to the part of himself that refused to settle for safe mediocrity. Outside his window, the lights of Copper Ridge twinkled in the darkness, and beyond them, hidden in the shadows of the mountains, the Blackwater mine waited with its ancient secrets and modern promises. In 3 days, Marcus would either be vindicated or ruined, but at least he would know the truth. The pumps continued their steady rhythm through the night, drawing water from depths that hadn't seen daylight in 15 years. And somewhere in those depths, in cavities carved from living rock and sealed by time and circumstance, the earth kept her secrets, and waited to see who would prove worthy of her treasures. Tuesday morning brought the sound Marcus had been waiting for, the change in pitch of the pumps that meant they were finally drawing air instead of solid water. He arrived at the mine before dawn to find Jack already there, testing a headlamp and checking the charge on a portable radio. Water's down about 12 feet, Jack reported, his breath visible in the cold morning air. Should be able to get into the main tunnel by this afternoon, assuming the supports held up. Danny arrived with coffee and what he called mining breakfast. Energy bars, beef jerky, and bottled water. The 3 men stood at the edge of the mine, watching the last of the muddy water disappear into the drainage channel Jack had dug. 15 years, Jack muttered, shaking his head. 15 years that tunnel's been sealed up like a tomb. The entrance revealed itself gradually as the water receded. First came the top of the wooden support frame, dark with rot and slime. Then, the mouth of the tunnel itself, a black rectangle that seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it. The smell that rose from the depths was thick and organic, like mushrooms and decay mixed with something metallic that caught in the back of the throat. Marcus felt his pulse quicken as he stared into that darkness. Somewhere beyond that threshold lay the answers to questions that had consumed his grandfather's life. But the black mouth of the tunnel also looked like exactly what it was. A dangerous hole in the ground that had already claimed years of hard work and dreams. "We'll need to test the air before we go down," Jack said, pulling a small electronic device from his pack. 15 years of standing water, there could be methane buildup, hydrogen sulfide, all kinds of nasty stuff. The air quality meter beeped and flashed green lights as Jack held it near the tunnel entrance. The readings looked good. Oxygen levels normal, no dangerous gases detected. But Marcus noticed that Jack's hands were shaking slightly as he operated the device. "You nervous?" Marcus asked. Jack looked at him with eyes that held decades of mining experience. "Son, if you're not nervous about going into a hole in the ground that's been sealed up for 15 years, then you're not smart enough to be mining." They spent the morning making final preparations. Jack had brought modern LED headlamps that would provide hours of bright, reliable light. Danny loaded a backpack with emergency supplies, first aid kit, emergency radio, protein bars, and enough water for a full day underground. They tested their communication system, a set of two-way radios that would keep them in contact with the surface. The plan was simple. Jack and Marcus would make the initial descent to assess the condition of the tunnels and locate the areas marked on the old man's maps. Danny would remain on the surface, monitoring communications and ready to call for help if something went wrong. "First rule of mining," Jack explained as they geared up. "Never go down alone and always have someone topside who knows where you are." By noon, the water level had dropped enough to reveal the first 50 feet of the main tunnel. The wooden support beams were intact, but blackened with age and moisture. Water still dripped from the ceiling in a steady rhythm that echoed off the rock walls like a geological heartbeat. Marcus clipped his headlamp to his hard hat and tested the beam. The light cut through the darkness ahead, revealing glimpses of rock walls and wooden supports that disappeared into shadows. His grandfather had walked this same tunnel thousands of times, following his instincts and his geological training deeper into the earth with each passing year. "Ready?" Jack asked, adjusting his own equipment. Marcus nodded, though his mouth was dry with anticipation and fear. They stepped over the threshold together, their boots splashing through puddles of stagnant water that reflected their headlamp beams like black mirrors. The tunnel was wider than Marcus had expected, carved through solid rock with the kind of precision that spoke of professional mining operations. The walls showed tool marks from decades of excavation, and side passages branched off at regular intervals. Some of these had been blocked with wooden barriers, while others disappeared into darkness that their lights couldn't penetrate. "Your grandfather was methodical," Jack observed, stopping to examine one of the blocked passages. "See how he marked each tunnel? Date it was started. Date it was abandoned. Notes about what he found." Marcus read the faded chalk marks on the wooden barrier. Started March 3, 1987. Played out April 15th. Quartz vein, no color. The handwriting was definitely his grandfather's, the same careful script he'd seen on the maps and letters. They continued deeper into the mine, following the main tunnel as it curved to the left and began to slope downward more steeply. The air grew cooler as they descended, and Marcus could feel the weight of the mountain pressing down above them. The sound of dripping water grew louder, echoing off the walls in a complex rhythm that seemed almost musical. "Here," Jack said, stopping at a junction where 3 tunnels met. He consulted one of the old man's maps, holding it up to catch the light from both their headlamps. "According to this, the J sector starts down that way. That's where your grandfather was working when the flood hit." The tunnel that led to J sector was narrower than the main passage, barely wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side. The walls here showed signs of more recent work, cleaner tool marks, fewer mineral stains, wooden supports that still had some of their original color. Marcus ran his hand along the rock wall, feeling the texture of stone that had been buried in darkness for millions of years, before his grandfather's picks and shovels had exposed it to light. The rock was harder here, a different composition than what they'd seen in the upper tunnels. "Feel that?" Jack asked, touching the wall near Marcus's hand. "That's granite. Good, solid rock. Your grandfather knew what he was doing, following the formation down to where the real treasure might be hidden." They walked for another 10 minutes, their headlamps creating moving pools of light in the absolute darkness. The tunnel curved and twisted, following the natural contours of the rock formation. Side passages appeared and disappeared, some blocked off, others barely more than cracks in the stone. Then Jack stopped so suddenly that Marcus almost walked into him. "What is it?" Jack was staring at something on the tunnel wall, his headlamp beam fixed on a section of rock that looked different from the rest. Instead of the rough, tool-marked surface they'd been seeing, this section was smooth and crystalline, shot through with veins of white and silver that caught their lights and threw them back in prismatic flashes. "Quartz," Jack breathed. "Beautiful quartz. Your grandfather must have been following this vein when he found whatever he found." Marcus moved closer, examining the crystal formation. Even to his untrained eye, it was clearly valuable. The quartz was pure and clear, formed into natural crystal structures that looked like something from a museum display. But it was the way the light behaved around these crystals that made him catch his breath. Instead of simply reflecting their headlamp beams, the quartz seemed to amplify and transform the light, breaking it into component colors and casting rainbow patterns on the tunnel walls. The effect was hypnotic, almost alive, as if the rock itself was breathing light. "I've never seen quartz do that," Marcus said. Jack was running his hands over the crystal formation, his weathered fingers tracing the natural facets and edges. "Neither have I. This is something special, something rare." They followed the quartz vein deeper into the tunnel, their excitement building with each step. The crystal formation grew larger and more complex as they descended, branching out into the walls and ceiling like a frozen lightning bolt captured in stone. Then the tunnel opened into a natural chamber, and both men stopped dead in their tracks. The room was perhaps 20 feet across and 15 feet high, its walls lined with crystal formations that made the quartz in the tunnel look like practice sketches. But it wasn't the size or beauty of the crystals that took their breath away. It was what lay scattered across the chamber floor. Stones, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, ranging in size from pebbles to objects as large as golf balls. In the light from their headlamps, the stones threw back fire and color with an intensity that made Marcus's eyes water. Reds, blues, greens, yellows, every color imaginable danced and flickered as their lights moved across the chamber. "Jesus Christ," Jack whispered, his voice barely audible in the crystal-lined space. "Jesus Christ, Marcus, do you know what these are?" Marcus was already kneeling among the stones, picking up a specimen about the size of a marble. It was clear as water, but when he held it up to his headlamp, it exploded with internal fire that seemed to have its own source of energy. "They can't be," Marcus said, though his hands were shaking as he examined the stone. "Diamonds don't form in granite. They don't form in this kind of geology." Jack was moving through the chamber like a man in a dream, picking up stones and examining them in his light. Each one threw back the same impossible fire, the same crystalline perfection that spoke of carbon compressed under unimaginable pressure and heat. "The geology books don't know everything," Jack said, his voice thick with wonder. "Sometimes the Earth keeps surprises even from the scientists." Marcus stood slowly, his pockets already heavy with specimens. The chamber stretched back into shadows that their lights couldn't fully penetrate, and he could see more stones glittering in the darkness like terrestrial stars. "How many do you think there are?" Jack was examining a stone the size of a golf ball, turning it in the light and watching the colors dance across its faceted surface. "Hundreds in this chamber alone. And look at the walls. See how the crystal formations continue back into that passage? This might just be the beginning." They spent the next hour collecting samples and exploring the chamber. The passage that Jack had spotted did indeed continue, opening into a second chamber that was even larger than the first. Here, the stones were embedded in the walls themselves, part of crystal formations that looked like they'd been growing for millennia. Marcus found himself thinking about Emma, about her school project on rocks and minerals. "Daddy, did you know that diamonds are made from carbon? Sometimes they stay hidden for millions of years before somebody finds them." His 8-year-old daughter had unknowingly described exactly what he was looking at. "We need to get some of these tested," Marcus said, though he already knew what the tests would show. Nothing else in nature created that kind of fire, that perfect clarity and brilliance. Jack nodded, carefully wrapping several of the larger specimens in cloth before placing them in his pack. "I know a guy in Denver, used to work for one of the big mining companies. He can do a proper analysis, tell us exactly what we're dealing with." They were preparing to leave when Marcus noticed something that made him pause. In one corner of the second chamber, partially hidden behind a curtain of crystal formations, was what looked like a man-made structure. He moved closer, pushing aside the crystals to get a better look. It was a wooden crate, old and weathered but still intact. Painted on the side in faded letters were the words, W. Blackwater, 1924. "Jack, look at this." The older man joined him behind the crystal curtain, his headlamp illuminating the ancient crate. William Blackwater, the original owner of this claim. Marcus tried to lift the crate, but it was heavier than expected. Jack helped him maneuver it out from behind the crystals and into the open area of the chamber. The lid was secured with old-fashioned iron latches that opened with a metallic screech that echoed off the crystal walls. Inside the crate, wrapped in what had once been canvas but was now little more than decayed fiber, were stones that made everything they'd found so far look like practice gems. These were diamonds the size of walnuts, perfectly formed octahedrons that caught their lights and threw them back with such intensity that both men had to shield their eyes. "My God," Jack breathed. Blackwater knew. He found this chamber 90 years ago and hid the best specimens. Marcus picked up one of the larger stones, a crystal that must have weighed several ounces. In the light from his headlamp, it was like holding a piece of captured starlight. The internal fire seemed to move and dance as he turned it, colors shifting and blending in patterns that hypnotized the eye. "Why hide them?" Marcus asked. If he found diamonds like this, why not sell them and become rich? Jack was examining the inside of the crate, looking for more clues. Maybe he tried. Maybe nobody believed him. Or maybe he was smart enough to know that news of a diamond find would bring too much attention, too many people with guns and lawyers. At the bottom of the crate, wrapped in an oilcloth that had somehow survived the decades, was a leather journal. Marcus opened it carefully, squinting at the faded handwriting in the dim light. "May 15th, 1924, he read aloud. "Found the mother lode today. Crystals beyond anything I ever dreamed. Perfect diamonds formed by some geological miracle I don't understand. But I've seen what happens when word gets out about finds like this. The government men come, the big companies move in, and the man who did the work gets pushed aside." Marcus flipped through several pages, reading entries that documented Blackwater's growing paranoia and his decision to hide his discovery rather than exploit it. September 3rd, 1924. Sealed the chamber today. Left markers that only someone who really understands this mountain would recognize. Someday, when the time is right, someone will follow the clues and find what I found. Until then, the Earth will keep her secrets. The journal contained detailed maps and geological observations, along with Blackwater's theories about how diamonds could form in granite under the specific conditions present in this mountain. Most of it was beyond Marcus's understanding, but the passion and knowledge behind the writing were unmistakable. He was a scientist as much as a miner, Marcus said, closing the journal carefully. This isn't just about finding pretty rocks. He understood something about the geology here that nobody else did. Jack was repacking the specimens they'd collected, his movements careful and deliberate. "Your grandfather must have found some of Blackwater's markers, followed the same clues that led us here today." They made their way back through the tunnels, their packs heavy with samples, and their minds spinning with the implications of what they'd discovered. The walk back to the surface seemed to take forever, each step carrying them further from the impossible treasure chamber and closer to a world that would never be the same. Danny was waiting at the mine entrance, pacing nervously and checking his watch. "You guys have been down there for over 3 hours. I was starting to worry." "We're fine," Jack said, but his voice carried an excitement that made Danny look at him sharply. "Did you find anything?" Marcus and Jack exchanged glances. How do you tell someone that you've just discovered what might be the largest diamond deposit in North America, hidden in a place where diamonds weren't supposed to exist? "We found some interesting mineral specimens," Marcus said carefully. "We'll need to get them tested before we know exactly what we're dealing with." But Danny had been around mining long enough to recognize the signs. The way his father's hands shook as he set down his pack, the careful way Marcus avoided eye contact, the electric tension that seemed to surround both men. "Dad," Danny said quietly, "what did you really find down there?" Jack looked at his son for a long moment, then reached into his pack and pulled out one of the smaller specimens. He held it up to catch the afternoon sunlight, and the stone exploded with fire that made all three men catch their breath. "We found Grandpa Chen's firestones," Jack said simply, "and a whole lot more." They spent the rest of the afternoon organizing their samples and planning their next moves. The specimens needed to be tested by a qualified gemologist, but that would take time and money that Marcus wasn't sure he had. Meanwhile, the clock was ticking on his financial obligations, and Hayes from Mountain West Development was probably expecting an answer to his offer. "We can't tell anyone about this," Marcus said as they secured the mine entrance for the night. "Not until we know exactly what we're dealing with and what our options are." Jack nodded. "In the morning, I'll drive to Denver with some samples. I've got a friend who owes me a favor, and he can do the analysis quietly. No paperwork, no official records, just between friends." Danny was still staring at the specimens they'd laid out on the camp table, his expression somewhere between wonder and disbelief. "How many stones do you think are down there?" "Thousands," Marcus replied. "Maybe tens of thousands. And if Blackwater's journal is right, there are other chambers we haven't even found yet." The implications were staggering. If the stones were genuine diamonds, and if there were as many as they thought, then Marcus wasn't just looking at financial security. He was looking at wealth beyond anything he'd ever imagined, enough to solve not just his own problems but to change the lives of everyone in Copper Ridge. But with that potential came dangers he was only beginning to understand. Companies like Mountain West Development didn't make generous offers for worthless properties. Somehow, they knew or suspected what lay beneath the Blackwater mine, and they wouldn't give up easily. That evening, Marcus sat in his motel room with Blackwater's journal spread open before him, trying to decipher the old prospector's coded references and geological observations. The writing was dense and technical, filled with terms he didn't recognize, and theories about diamond formation that seemed to contradict everything he thought he knew about geology. But one passage near the end of the journal made his blood run cold. November 20th, 1924. They're watching the mine now. Black automobiles on the Ridge Road, men in suits asking questions in town. "The government wants to know what I've found, and the big companies are circling like vultures. I've made my decision. Better to seal the chamber and let the earth keep her secrets than to see this place turned into another industrial wasteland." November 25th, 1924. Final entry. "Tomorrow I leave for California, where my sister says a man can disappear if he wants to badly enough. I've left clues for someone worthy, someone who understands that some treasures are worth more than money. The mountain will choose who finds what I've hidden, and I pray it chooses wisely." Marcus closed the journal, his hands trembling slightly. Blackwater had faced the same choice that Marcus was facing now: exploit the discovery and deal with the consequences, or protect it and hope that someday the right person would come along. The difference was that Marcus didn't have the luxury of walking away. His daughter needed him, his debts weren't going to disappear, and Friday's deadline was approaching with the inevitability of a landslide. He was reaching for his phone to call Jack when it rang, displaying a number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Chen, this is Robert Hayes from Mountain West Development." "I hope I'm not calling too late." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. "What can I do for you, Mr. Hayes?" "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I wanted to make sure you understood that our offer won't be available indefinitely. The market for mineral rights is volatile, and my investors are considering other opportunities. I told you I needed time to think. Of course, but I'd hate to see you miss out on this opportunity while you're chasing fantasies about striking it rich. Mining is a risky business, Mr. Chen. Most people who try it end up poorer than when they started." There was something in Hayes' tone that suggested he knew more than he was letting on. Marcus thought about the black SUV, the expensive suits, the timing of their offer. "How exactly did you know I was working the mine?" Marcus asked. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "As I said, word travels fast in small towns. People talk." "What people?" Another pause, longer this time. "Mr. Chen, I think you're overthinking this. We're simply businessmen trying to make a fair deal. $200,000 is more money than most people see in a lifetime. And if I say no, then you say no. But I'd encourage you to consider the risks you're taking. Old mines are dangerous places. Accidents happen. Environmental problems arise. Legal complications can drag on for years." The line went quiet except for the soft hum of static, Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Hayes?" "Threatening? No, of course not. I'm simply pointing out the realities of the mining business. Think about it, Mr. Chen. You have a daughter to consider, responsibilities that go beyond your own dreams of wealth." The line went dead, leaving Marcus staring at his phone in the dim light of the motel room. Hayes knew about Emma. Somehow, these people had done their homework, learned about his personal situation, his financial problems, his family. Marcus walked to the window and looked out at the dark mountains, trying to spot any sign of surveillance. The parking lot was empty except for a few other guest cars, and the road beyond was quiet. But somewhere out there, people were watching and waiting, people who knew more about the Blackwater mine than they were letting on. He thought about calling Jack, but what would he say? That he was paranoid? That a business offer had sounded vaguely threatening? In the cold light of reason, Hayes hadn't actually threatened anything. He'd simply pointed out the risks and complications that came with mining operations. But Marcus had learned to trust his instincts, and his instincts were telling him that Mountain West Development wasn't just another investment company. They were players in a game whose rules he didn't understand, and they held cards he couldn't see. He spent the rest of the evening reading through his grandfather's papers, looking for any mention of outside interest in the mine. Most of the documents were routine geological surveys, equipment receipts, correspondence with mining supply companies. But in a folder marked legal, he found something that made his pulse quicken. It was a letter from a law firm in Denver, dated just 6 months before his grandfather's death. The letterhead read, "Brennan, Walsh and Associates, Mining Law Specialists," and the content was brief but alarming. "Dear Mr. Chen, we represent certain parties who have expressed interest in acquiring mineral rights to the Blackwater mine property. Our clients are prepared to make a substantial offer for these rights, and we believe it would be in your best interest to meet with us at your earliest convenience. Please contact our office to arrange a meeting." Marcus found his grandfather's response in the same folder, a handwritten note on cheap stationery. "Gentlemen, I have no interest in selling my mineral rights to your clients or anyone else. The Blackwater mine is not for sale, and I would appreciate it if you would inform your clients that further contact will be unwelcome." There were 2 more letters from the law firm, each more insistent than the last, and 2 more polite but firm refusals from his grandfather. The correspondence ended abruptly, with no indication of why the lawyers had stopped writing. Marcus felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. His grandfather had been pressured to sell the mine, just as Marcus was being pressured now. But the old man had refused, and shortly afterward, he'd died of what the doctors had called natural causes. The rational part of Marcus's mind rejected the implications immediately. His grandfather had been in his 80s, had lived a hard life, had suffered from heart problems for years. His death had been sad, but not suspicious, the inevitable end of a long and difficult life. But the timing bothered him. The pressure from lawyers, the mysterious clients who wanted the mineral rights, the sudden death of the one person who stood between them and the property. Marcus shook his head, trying to clear away thoughts that bordered on paranoia. He was letting the stress and excitement of the day cloud his judgment. People died of natural causes all the time, and mining companies pressured property owners to sell all the time. There was nothing sinister about any of it. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important, some connection that would explain why so many people seemed interested in a supposedly worthless flooded mine. He was still pondering these questions when his phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed Jack's number. "Marcus, we've got a problem." "What kind of problem?" "Someone's been at the mine. Danny went up there to check on the equipment, and the camp's been searched. Nothing's missing, but everything's been moved around. Someone was looking for something." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "When?" "Had to be this afternoon, after we left. Danny found tire tracks that weren't there this morning, expensive tires on a heavy vehicle." "A black SUV," Marcus thought but didn't say. Hayes and his associate, looking for evidence of what they'd found in the tunnels. "Did they get into the mine itself?" "Doesn't look like it. The entrance is still sealed the way we left it." "But Marcus, they know something. People don't search mining camps unless they have a reason." Marcus thought about the phone call from Hayes, the veiled threats about accidents and complications. "Jack, I think we need to move fast. Get those samples to Denver first thing in the morning, and don't tell anyone where you're going." "Already planned on it." "But Marcus, if these people are as serious as they seem, we might be in over our heads." "We're already in over our heads. The question is whether we swim or drown." After Jack hung up, Marcus sat in the dark motel room, staring out at the mountains and trying to make sense of everything that had happened. 2 days ago, he'd been a failed businessman with crushing debts and a flooded mine he couldn't afford to keep. Now he was sitting on what might be the largest diamond discovery in North America, being pressured by mysterious investors and followed by men in expensive suits. The smart thing would be to take Hayes' offer and walk away. $200,000 would solve his immediate problems and let him start over somewhere else, somewhere safe. But the discovery in the mine wasn't just about money. It was about his grandfather's legacy, about dreams that had been passed down through generations, about the possibility of something extraordinary hidden beneath the surface of an ordinary world. Marcus thought about Emma, about the wonder in her voice when she talked about rocks and minerals and diamonds that stayed hidden for millions of years. What kind of father would he be if he gave up on the greatest discovery of his life just because it was dangerous? But what kind of father would he be if he got himself killed chasing that discovery? The questions chased each other around his mind until exhaustion finally dragged him into fitful sleep. In his dreams, he walked through crystal chambers filled with fire and light, following his grandfather's ghost deeper and deeper into the earth, while somewhere above, men in black suits waited patiently for him to emerge. He woke before dawn with the absolute certainty that everything was about to change and that there was no turning back from whatever came next. Jack Morrison's pickup truck kicked up dust clouds as it disappeared around the mountain curve, carrying precious cargo toward Denver and answers that would change everything. Marcus watched until the vehicle vanished completely, then turned his attention back to the Blackwater mine, where Danny was reinforcing the security measures around their makeshift camp. The younger Morrison had arrived before sunrise with steel cables, heavy-duty locks, and a grim expression that matched his father's mood. Word of the previous day's intrusion had spread through the family like wildfire, and Danny's protective instincts were clearly engaged. "Motion sensors," Danny explained, showing Marcus a collection of small electronic devices. "Solar-powered, wireless. Anyone comes within 50 feet of the mine entrance will know about it." He paused, studying Marcus's face. "Dad told me what you found down there. Said it was something that could change all our lives." Marcus nodded, his throat dry with the weight of secrets. "Your father's a good man. He didn't have to help me, didn't have to risk anything for a stranger. Dad's got his reasons. He loved your grandfather like a brother, even if they didn't always see eye to eye." Danny finished setting up the last sensor and tested it with his phone. Plus, he's been dreaming about what's in that mine for 15 years. Finding out was worth the risk. They spent the morning organizing equipment and planning security rotations. Marcus had insisted on staying at the mine rather than returning to the motel, partly for protection, and partly because he couldn't bear to be away from the discovery that represented his family's salvation. The satellite phone Marcus had purchased in town buzzed with an incoming call around noon. Jack's voice crackled through the static, barely audible over the mountain interference. "Marcus, you need to hear this. My friend in Denver, the gemologist, he's preliminary tested 3 of our samples." Marcus pressed the phone closer to his ear, his heart hammering against his ribs. "And? They're genuine. High-quality diamonds, some of the clearest specimens he's ever seen. The largest one we brought tested at just over 8 carats. D-color, internally flawless. He estimates its value at close to $200,000. The world seemed to tilt around Marcus. One stone worth $200,000. Hayes had offered the same amount for the entire mineral rights, clearly knowing that what lay beneath the surface was worth exponentially more. "That's just one stone, Jack. We saw thousands down there." "I know. And Marcus, there's something else." My friend recognized the geological signature, the way these diamonds formed. He says he's only seen similar patterns in stones from one other location. "Where?" Jack's voice dropped to a whisper, as if he feared being overheard even hundreds of miles away. "The Kimberley mine in South Africa. Some of the most valuable diamonds ever discovered came from formations just like what we found under your grandfather's mountain." Marcus sank into one of the camp chairs, overwhelmed by the implications. The Kimberley mine had produced some of the world's most famous diamonds, stones worth tens of millions of dollars each. If the Blackwater Formation was similar, then they weren't just looking at financial security. They were looking at generational wealth that could transform not just their lives but the entire town of Copper Ridge. "How long before you get back?" Marcus asked. "Few hours." "But Marcus, we need to be careful how we handle this. Word gets out about a find this big, we'll have mining companies, government regulators, and God knows who else swarming all over us." After Jack hung up, Marcus sat in the mountain silence, trying to process what he'd learned. 8 carats. $200,000. For a single stone that represented perhaps 1,000th of what they'd discovered in the crystal chambers below. Danny approached with 2 cups of coffee and a concerned expression. "Good news or bad news?" "Both," Marcus replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "The stones are real. Better than real. But that means our problems are just beginning." As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching vehicles echoed off the canyon walls. Marcus and Danny both reached for the binoculars, scanning the access road for signs of trouble. 3 black SUVs wound their way up the mountain path, moving with the kind of coordinated precision that suggested military or law enforcement backgrounds. Marcus recognized the lead vehicle as the same one Hayes had arrived in 2 days earlier, but the convoy suggested that Mountain West Development had decided to escalate their approach. "Time to find out what we're really dealing with," Marcus muttered, checking that his phone was recording as the vehicles pulled into the mine's perimeter. Hayes emerged from the lead SUV, accompanied by the same silent associate from before, but the other vehicles discharged men who clearly weren't businessmen. They wore tactical clothing, moved with professional awareness, and carried themselves like people accustomed to getting their way through intimidation rather than negotiation. "Mr. Chen," Hayes called out, his smile as artificial as his friendly tone. "I hope you've had time to consider our offer." Marcus remained seated, forcing his voice to stay level, still thinking it over. "Though I notice you brought more friends this time." "Security consultants. The mountain roads can be dangerous, and we're carrying sensitive documents." Hayes gestured toward the mine entrance. "Mind if we take a look at what you're working with? Professional assessment? Nothing more." "Actually, I do mind. This is private property, and you don't have permission to be here." Hayes' smile flickered, revealing something harder underneath. "Mr. Chen, I think there's been a misunderstanding about the nature of our relationship. You see, my clients don't just want to buy your mineral rights. They need to buy them." One of the security consultants had been circling the camp, photographing equipment and taking notes. Danny stepped between the man and their supply tent, his jaw set in a way that suggested the situation was about to escalate. "Need?" Marcus asked, standing slowly. "That's an interesting choice of words." The Blackwater mine sits on top of geological formations that extend far beyond your property boundaries. Formations that my clients have been studying for quite some time. Your grandfather's refusal to cooperate created certain complications that we're hoping to resolve amicably. Marcus felt puzzle pieces clicking into place with an almost audible snap. "How long have you known what's down there?" Hayes glanced toward his associates, some silent communication passing between them. When he looked back at Marcus, the pretense of friendliness had completely disappeared. "Long enough to understand that you're in possession of something that belongs to people much more powerful than yourself. The question is whether you're smart enough to take the generous offer we've made, or stubborn enough to suffer the same fate as your grandfather." The threat hung in the mountain air like smoke from a forest fire. Marcus felt Danny tense beside him, ready for whatever came next, but outnumbered 6-2 with no clear avenue of escape. "What happened to my grandfather?" "Natural causes, according to the official records." "Heart failure. Very sad." Hayes' voice carried the satisfaction of a man revealing a winning hand. "Of course, natural causes can be accelerated when an elderly man is under significant stress. Financial pressure, legal complications, health problems that require expensive medication." Marcus thought about the letters from the law firm, the increasing pressure to sell, the timing of his grandfather's death. "You killed him." "We didn't have to. We simply made his life unlivable until his heart gave out. Much cleaner than alternatives. and it left the mineral rights in family hands where they could be acquired through proper legal channels. The confession was delivered with the casual indifference of a man discussing the weather. Marcus realized that Hayes had revealed his involvement because he expected no witnesses to survive the conversation. The sound of an approaching helicopter cut through the tension, its rotors beating against the thin mountain air. Hayes looked skyward with an expression of annoyance rather than concern, clearly not expecting the aircraft. "That would be the cavalry," Danny said quietly, his hand moving towards something concealed under his jacket. The helicopter circled the mine site twice before settling onto a flat area near the access road. The side door slid open, and Jack Morrison stepped out, followed by two men in expensive suits who carried themselves with the confidence of people accustomed to wielding significant authority. Hayes's expression shifted from annoyance to genuine concern as he recognized the newcomers. "Mr. Patterson," he said to his associate, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "I believe we have a problem." The older of the two men approached the camp with the measured pace of someone who owned whatever ground he walked on. He was perhaps 60, silver-haired and immaculately dressed, but his eyes held the cold calculation of a man who'd built his fortune by crushing anyone who stood in his way. "Mr. Hayes," the man said, his voice carrying a slight accent that Marcus couldn't place, "I wasn't expecting to find you here, especially not with what appears to be a small army." Hayes straightened, trying to regain some measure of authority. "Mr. Kozlov, we were just concluding negotiations with Mr. Chen. Everything is proceeding according to plan." Kozlov's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "According to whose plan?" "Because my understanding was that Mountain West Development was supposed to be negotiating quietly, not staging military operations on American soil." Marcus looked between the two men, recognizing the tension of competing interests suddenly brought into collision. Hayes worked for Kozlov, or at least someone Kozlov represented, but the Russian's arrival suggested that Hayes had exceeded his authority. "Jack," Marcus called out, his voice carrying across the camp. "Good timing." The older Morrison approached, flanked by Kozlov's companion and carrying a leather briefcase that suggested serious business. "Marcus, I'd like you to meet Viktor Kozlov. He represents certain international interests that have been monitoring geological developments in this region." Kozlov extended a manicured hand. "Mr. Chen, please accept my apologies for the crude methods employed by Mr. Hayes. I assure you that my organization prefers more civilized approaches to business." Marcus shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip and the way Kozlov's eyes never left his face. "More civilized than threatening my family and murdering my grandfather? Your grandfather's death was regrettable, but unrelated to our business interests. As for threats to your family, that represents exactly the kind of unprofessional behavior that my organization cannot tolerate." Kozlov turned toward Hayes, and Marcus saw something in the Russian's expression that made his blood run cold. Hayes apparently saw it too, because he took an involuntary step backward. "Mr. Hayes, you and your team will return to Denver immediately. Your contract with our organization is terminated, effective immediately." "Sir, we're so close to completing the acquisition. Give us another day, and—" "Mr. Hayes." Kozlov's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. "You will leave now, or you will be removed. The choice is yours." Hayes looked around the camp, his gaze lingering on Marcus and Danny before settling on his security consultants. Whatever he saw in their faces convinced him that arguing would be futile. Within minutes, the three SUVs were disappearing down the mountain road, leaving behind only dust clouds and the echo of expensive engines. "Much better," Kozlov said, straightening his tie and smiling as if nothing unusual had happened. "Now we can discuss business like civilized people." Jack opened his briefcase and pulled out a manila folder thick with documents. "Marcus, Mr. Kozlov's organization has made a very different kind of offer. One, I think you should hear." Kozlov gestured toward the camp chairs as if he were hosting a boardroom meeting rather than standing beside a hole in the ground. "Mr. Chen, my geological consultants have been monitoring this region for several years. We knew that significant diamond deposits existed somewhere in this mountain range, but we were never able to pinpoint the exact location. Until my grandfather started finding stones." "Precisely," The geological surveys your grandfather commissioned, the ore samples he had analyzed, the equipment purchases he made, all of it pointed to a discovery of unprecedented significance. Kolb. Kozlov accepted a cup of coffee from Danny, sipping it as if he had all the time in the world. When your grandfather refused to cooperate with our initial overtures, we authorized Mr. Hayes to apply pressure through legal and financial channels. Marcus felt anger building in his chest, pressure that killed him. Mr. Hayes exceeded his authority. His methods were crude and ultimately counterproductive. Your grandfather's death solved nothing and created the current complications. Danny had been listening with growing agitation. Current complications? You mean having to deal with people who actually have legal rights to the property? Kozlov's smile didn't waver. Legal rights are important, Mr. Morrison, but they're not absolute. Mineral deposits of this magnitude become matters of national security, international commerce, geopolitical significance. Individual property rights, while respected, must be balanced against broader interests. Jack spread the documents from his briefcase across the camp table. Marcus, they're offering a partnership. Full legal ownership remains with you, but they provide the capital, equipment, and expertise needed to properly develop the deposit. Marcus studied the papers, trying to make sense of legal language that seemed designed to obscure rather than clarify. What kind of partnership? 60-40 split of all profits, Kozlov explained. You retain the 60%. We take 40%, in exchange for providing everything needed to turn your discovery into a functioning mining operation. Conservative estimates suggest annual production values in excess of $50 million once the operation is fully developed. The numbers were staggering. 60% of $50 million was $30 million annually, enough to solve every financial problem Marcus had ever imagined having. But something about Kozlov's manner suggested that accepting the offer would come with complications that weren't outlined in the paperwork. And if I refuse? Kozlov's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the atmosphere around the table. Refusal would be unfortunate for everyone involved. You see, Mr. Chen, diamond deposits of this quality don't remain secret very long. Word will leak, other interests will become involved, and you'll find yourself dealing with people far less reasonable than myself. People like Hayes, people who make Mr. Hayes look like a humanitarian. Kozlov finished his coffee and set the cup down with deliberate precision. My organization has the resources to protect your interests and ensure orderly development of the deposit. Others who might become interested would view you as an obstacle to be removed rather than a partner to be protected. Marcus looked at Jack, reading years of mining experience in the older man's weathered features. What do you think? I think we're dealing with forces bigger than anything your grandfather ever imagined, Jack replied carefully. The question is whether we try to work with those forces or get crushed by them. Danny had been photographing the documents with his phone, clearly documenting everything for later analysis. What guarantees do we have that this partnership won't turn into a takeover once the mining operation is established? Kozlov's companion spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a slight British accent. Legal protections, international arbitration clauses, insurance policies that protect against exactly those scenarios. Mr. Chen's ownership rights would be guaranteed by entities with far more resources than any mining company. The sound of approaching vehicles interrupted the negotiation. This time, it was official vehicles, county sheriff's deputies, and what looked like federal agents in unmarked cars. Marcus counted at least a dozen men in various uniforms and tactical gear, all moving with the purposeful efficiency of a coordinated law enforcement operation. Sheriff Tom Bradley emerged from the lead vehicle, a man Marcus remembered from childhood visits to Copper Ridge. Bradley had aged considerably, his hair gray and his face lined with years of dealing with mountain folk and their complicated problems. "Afternoon, Marcus," Bradley said, his tone suggesting this wasn't a social call. "Heard you've been having some interesting visitors up here." Marcus gestured toward Kozlov and his companion. "Just discussing business, Sheriff. Business that requires federal oversight, apparently." Bradley nodded toward the federal agents who were spreading out around the camp with professional thoroughness. "Seems like your little mining operation has attracted attention from some very important people in Washington." The lead federal agent approached, displaying credentials that identified him as Special Agent Morrison from the Department of the Interior. He was younger than Marcus had expected, perhaps 40, with the kind of intense focus that suggested significant experience in complex investigations. "Mr. Chen, I'm Agent Morrison. We need to discuss the geological discoveries on your property and their implications for national mineral security." Kozlov remained seated, but his companion had moved closer, clearly prepared for whatever complications were about to arise. The Russian's expression suggested this wasn't his first encounter with federal investigators. "Agent Morrison," Kozlov said smoothly, "I assume you're here because of reports filed by certain parties who were recently removed from this site?" "Among other things. We've also been monitoring communications and financial transactions related to this property. Transactions that suggest mineral discoveries of significant strategic importance." Marcus felt like he was watching a chess game, where he didn't understand the rules, or even which pieces belonged to which side. Federal agents, Russian businessmen, mining companies with private security forces, all of them apparently interested in something his grandfather had found while following quartz veins through granite tunnels. "Strategic importance?" Marcus asked. Agent Morrison consulted a tablet device before responding. "Diamond deposits of this quality and quantity have implications beyond simple commercial value. Industrial diamonds, gemstone-quality stones, rare mineral formations associated with diamond-bearing rock. All of these have applications in defense, technology, and international trade." Jack had been unusually quiet during the federal agent's arrival, but now he stepped forward with the confidence of a man who dealt with government bureaucracy before. "Agent Morrison, Mr. Chen is the legal owner of this property and any minerals it contains. Unless you're here with warrants or court orders, I suggest we keep this conversation friendly and voluntary." Morrison smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Mr. Morrison, I assume? We've been reviewing geological surveys filed by various parties over several decades. Your name appears frequently in association with mining operations throughout this region. I've been mining these mountains for 40 years. That's not a crime." "No, but filing false geological reports to hide mineral discoveries is. As is failing to report strategic mineral finds to appropriate federal agencies." The accusation hung in the mountain air, like smoke from a lightning strike. Marcus realized that Agent Morrison wasn't just investigating the current situation. He was building a case that went back years, possibly decades, encompassing not just the Blackwater mine but other mining operations throughout the region. Danny stepped closer to his father, his hand moving toward the concealed weapon Marcus had noticed earlier. The federal agents noticed the movement, several of them shifting position in response. "Gentlemen," Sheriff Bradley said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades diffusing volatile situations, "let's everybody take a step back and remember we're all Americans here." Kozlov chose that moment to stand, his movement attracting attention from every armed person in the camp. "Agent Morrison, perhaps this would be an appropriate time to mention that my organization has full diplomatic immunity and operates under international treaties that supersede local mineral rights laws." Morrison's expression darkened. Diplomatic immunity doesn't cover industrial espionage or theft of American natural resources. "Theft?" Kozlov's smile was sharp as broken glass. "I prefer to think of it as international commerce conducted under proper legal frameworks." Marcus watched the confrontation escalate, realizing that his simple inheritance had become the center of what appeared to be an international incident. Federal agents faced off against Russian businessmen, while local law enforcement tried to maintain order, and his newfound partners prepared for what might become a shooting war. The satellite phone in his pocket buzzed with an incoming call. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but something made him answer despite the chaos surrounding him. "Daddy?" Emma's voice was small and frightened, barely audible over the static. "There are men at our house. They want to talk to Mommy about you." Marcus felt the world tilt around him. While he'd been focused on federal agents and Russian businessmen, someone had moved against his family. The game had escalated beyond threats and negotiations to direct action against the people he loved most. "Emma, where's your mother?" "She's talking to them in the living room. They showed her badges and said they needed to ask questions about your business activities." Marcus looked around the camp, counting armed men from multiple agencies and organizations, all of them focused on the geological treasure hidden beneath his feet. None of them seemed to care that an 8-year-old girl was frightened by strange men in her home. "Emma, I need you to go to your room and lock the door. Don't come out until Mommy tells you it's safe." "Daddy, I'm scared." "I know, sweetheart. But everything's going to be okay, I promise." He ended the call and looked around the camp, seeing the situation with sudden clarity. Federal agents, Russian businessmen, mining companies, armed security forces, all of them treating his discovery like a prize to be won rather than the foundation of his daughter's future. "Agent Morrison," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the multiple conversations taking place around the camp. "I need to make a phone call to my lawyer." Morrison looked up from his confrontation with Kozlov. "Mr. Chen, I'm afraid that won't be possible at this time. This site is now under federal investigation, and all communications are subject to monitoring and approval. My 8-year-old daughter just called to tell me that federal agents are questioning her mother. Either you call off your people, or this conversation ends right now." The camp went quiet, everyone suddenly focused on Marcus and the simple parental authority in his voice. He realized that for all their resources and expertise, none of these people had considered the human cost of their maneuvering. "Mr. Chen," Agent Morrison said carefully, "no federal agents have been dispatched to Phoenix. If someone is claiming federal authority at your family's residence, they're operating without authorization." Marcus felt ice water in his veins. If federal agents weren't questioning Sarah and Emma, then who was? Hayes had been dismissed by Kozlov, but that didn't mean he'd given up on acquiring the mineral rights. And there were other players in this game, people whose interests and methods remained hidden. Kozlov was already on his phone, speaking rapidly in Russian to someone who apparently had the resources to verify situations in Phoenix. When he finished the call, his expression was grim. "Mr. Chen, my people confirm that unknown individuals claiming federal authority are currently at your family's residence. Local police have been called, but the situation remains fluid." Danny had moved to the equipment tent and was pulling out gear that definitely wasn't standard mining equipment. "Dad, we need to move now. Every minute we waste here is another minute those people have to hurt Marcus's family." Jack nodded, his years of military service showing in the way he assessed the tactical situation. "Agent Morrison, Mr. Chen is coming with us to Phoenix. His family is in danger, and that takes priority over mineral rights and international commerce." Morrison looked around the camp, clearly recognizing that the situation had spiraled beyond his ability to control. "Mr. Chen, if you leave this site, you'll be considered a fugitive from a federal investigation." "Then arrest me," Marcus replied, walking toward Jack's pickup truck. "But understand that I'm going to protect my daughter, regardless of what that means for your investigation." Kozlov intercepted him before he reached the vehicle. "Mr. Chen, my organization has resources that federal agents lack. Helicopters, private security, international connections that can resolve situations quickly and quietly." Marcus looked at the Russian businessman, weighing offers against risks in a calculation that could determine his family's safety. "What do you want in return?" "Partnership agreement, signed and witnessed. 40% of mineral rights in exchange for immediate protection of your family and long-term security for your operation." It was extortion disguised as business, but Marcus could hear Emma's frightened voice echoing in his memory. Federal agents would work through proper channels, file appropriate paperwork, coordinate with local authorities. By the time they acted, his family could be dead. "Deal," Marcus said, accepting the documents Kozlov's companion produced with suspicious speed. "But if anything happens to my daughter, our partnership ends permanently." Kozlov's smile was genuinely warm for the first time since his arrival. "Mr. Chen, you've just made the smartest decision of your life." The helicopter ride to Phoenix was a blur of mountain scenery and radio communications in multiple languages. Kozlov's pilot flew with military precision, cutting through restricted airspace with the confidence of someone who'd cleared the flight through channels that civilian aircraft couldn't access. Marcus spent the flight on satellite phones, coordinating with Sarah, local police, and the private security team that Kozlov had somehow dispatched to Phoenix within minutes of their agreement. The efficiency was impressive and terrifying in equal measure. By the time they landed at a private airfield outside Phoenix, The situation at Sarah's house had been resolved. The men claiming federal authority had been detained by local police and identified as private contractors working for a security company with ties to Mountain West Development. Hayes had made one final attempt to pressure Marcus through his family, and it had failed. Emma ran to him as he stepped out of the helicopter, her small arms wrapping around his waist with desperate strength. "Daddy, you came back." "I'll always come back, sweetheart. No matter what." Sarah stood nearby, her expression a mixture of relief and wariness. She'd aged in the months since their divorce, lines of stress around her eyes that hadn't been there during their marriage. But she was safe, Emma was safe, and that was all that mattered. "Marcus," she said quietly, "what have you gotten yourself involved in?" He looked back at the helicopter, where Kozlov was speaking on a satellite phone while his security team maintained professional alertness. In the distance, he could see federal vehicles approaching, Agent Morrison apparently having followed them to Phoenix through channels that civilian investigators couldn't access. "Something bigger than I ever imagined," Marcus replied, "but something that's going to change everything for Emma, for us, for everyone." The next few hours were a whirlwind of legal paperwork, federal debriefings, and financial arrangements that transformed Marcus from a desperate debtor into a wealthy partner in what government geologists were calling the most significant mineral discovery in North American history. The Blackwater mine would produce diamonds worth hundreds of millions of dollars annually. Marcus's 60% share would make him one of the wealthiest men in Colorado, with enough resources to provide for Emma's education, Sarah's security, and the economic revival of Copper Ridge. But more important than the money was the knowledge that he'd honored his grandfather's legacy, followed the old man's instincts and dreams to their logical conclusion. The firestones that had captivated generations of Chen family miners were finally seeing daylight, finally fulfilling the promise they'd held for nearly a century. 6 months later, Marcus stood at the entrance to the Blackwater mine, watching industrial equipment extract diamonds from crystal chambers that had waited millions of years to reveal their secrets. Emma stood beside him, her school geology project having evolved into a real understanding of the forces that created treasures in the deep places of the earth. Jack Morrison had been promoted to mine supervisor, his decades of experience finally receiving the recognition and compensation they deserved. Danny had taken over security operations, protecting the site with the same dedication he'd shown to protecting his family. Even Hayes had found a place in the new order, though not the one he'd expected. Federal investigators had traced his activities back through years of illegal mining operations, and he was currently serving a 10-year sentence for racketeering and extortion. Kozlov had proven to be exactly the partner he'd promised to be. His organization provided security, equipment, and international marketing networks that turned raw diamonds into finished jewelry sold in the world's most exclusive boutiques. The partnership had expanded beyond simple profit sharing to include educational programs, environmental restoration, and economic development throughout the mountain region. But the real treasure wasn't measured in carats or dollars. It was measured in Emma's laughter as she explored the geological wonders of her inheritance, in Sarah's smile when she realized that financial security meant she could return to the teaching career she'd abandoned years earlier, in the pride Jack Morrison felt when he showed visitors through mining operations that honored both modern safety standards and traditional craftsmanship. The Blackwater mine had kept its secrets for nearly a century, waiting for someone worthy of its treasures. In the end, it had chosen well. The earth had rewarded patience, perseverance, and the courage to follow dreams, even when they led into darkness. Standing in the mountain sunshine, watching diamonds emerge from depths that had hidden them since before human civilization existed, Marcus understood what his grandfather had always known. Some treasures are worth more than money, and the greatest discoveries come to those who refuse to give up on the impossible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.